Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and today my co-hosts Robert Brant and I are discussing the new law of the land in Canada, Bill C-5, which allows Canada's federal government to fast-track major infrastructure projects by bypassing regulations. It's been passed in response to Trump's tariff threats. However, significant Indigenous opposition and ongoing legal challenges may create potential investment risks through possible protests and project delays, despite the legislation's intent to streamline approvals. However, Canada is moving ahead. Hi, Rob. Great to see you today from cloudy London. We've had our heat wave, and now we're having our cooler wave with a lot of rain, so the reservoirs are filling up, which is great. How is it over in Canada, in Toronto? I think you're in Toronto.
Yeah, great to see you. I'm here in the Toronto office. We're midsummer, enjoying the heat and no complaints. It's a sunny, gorgeous day here in Toronto.
So no wildfire smoke is... The fires have calmed down a little bit out west?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, each day seems to bring a potential evacuation order somewhere in the country.
Wow.
But at the moment, things seem to be under control.
Good. Well, sunny skies in Toronto, so the rest of the country will be very happy. So, the election's over. Prime Minister Mark Carney is well installed. He's set up his cabinet, and he's leading a transformational moment for the country. And he set a very ambitious plan to move things ahead with something called the Building Canada Act, which I think is called Bill C-5.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind 6 months when you think back. Wow. And it's interesting to think about whether we would be here with initiatives like that. The Building Canada Act, the removing interprovincial trade barriers, lots of initiatives and lots of cooperation at the moment between premiers and the Prime Minister. We'll talk a little bit where Indigenous people fit into that, but whether we would be taking these kinds of measures at this moment without the impetus that came from south of the border and the current president of the United States, I doubt it. I mean, we're living with tariffs at the moment on steel and aluminum, and the threat of more tariffs, and all of that has produced a response within Canada. It probably affected our election, and it's affecting the legislation and the legislative agenda. It
certainly has, and we're in the early part of the week. So yesterday, the European Union agreed a deal, and I guess in principle, I'm not sure what you call these deals with the president, but anyway, they claim to agree a deal because the president's over in Scotland, which is becoming his Camelot, I guess, over in the UK. Is a great fondness for the UK. I'm not sure it's naturally returned, but he's been over here holding court, so to speak, and the European Union showed up and they got their deal. But as you said, some of these deals are very, some of these deals are very tenuous, and trade agreements take a long time. So we'll see if this deal even goes through, like some of the others, Japan and Korea, because they don't seem well written out documentation about exactly what's going to be. But you're right, the change in leadership in the U.S. and the approach of the new administration to the rest of the world has dramatically changed things. And although Canada has this deep relationship with America that has been productive for both countries, we're actually last to the party on signing something, which is true because, as Prime Minister Carney has said, we have a very unique relationship with the States that crosses many aspects in our geography, also defines our destiny. So there's a lot of issues going, but it is a new world. And Prime Minister Carney's been elected partly on that. And I think, as you mentioned, with the provinces, to see all the premiers really, we haven't seen the country so unified for a long time because we have lived in a very nice neighborhood, and Canada has, benefited from geography and a benevolent neighbor who happens to be one of the most powerful countries, if not the most powerful country in the world, for a number of years. And it's probably been 50 years since Canada's really had a debate and a need to decide what is the future of the country. And Prime Minister Carney is now leading that. So that is quite something.
Yeah, it struck me. I've been back in Canada now since March, and it really struck me first of all, how angry Canadians were at the treatment from the American government and the proposed high tariffs and a bunch of other things, and a lot of comments about a lot of derogatory comments about Canada and Canada's worth and all the rest. So I've never seen Canadians as angry as I saw when I came back, and it has unified Canadians right across the country, up and down and across, in a way that we haven't seen before, and the politicians are reflecting that in ways where they seem genuinely determined, and they've now taken some concrete steps to remove interprovincial trade barriers for one concrete step, and let's see what happens. There's some studies that suggest that the damage done by high tariffs in the U.S. and reduced trade with the U.S. would be more than offset by an increase in productivity that would result if we removed the interprovincial trade barriers. And it was a bit hypocritical for premiers and politicians in Canada to complain about high tariffs threatened from the U.S. when we have our own internal tariffs and trade barriers.
Yes, and for members of our audience who haven't seen angry Canadians before, I don't think many have seen an angry beaver either, but when they get angry, watch out if you step on their turf, I guess is the closest thing we can say. And I guess just for background for our listeners and viewers, there's a term in Canada, elbows up, which is about defending the country. And that comes, of course, from our other national game, which is lacrosse is one of our national games with deep Indigenous roots, but hockey. And elbows up as you go in those corners and you get your way through. You do it cleanly, but you get in there and fight for the puck and make it happen. So that's a big phrase in Canada, but that's really interesting. And I had a chance to go back to Canada in May, and I hadn't been back for a long time. And I was, you could feel exactly what you're talking about. And I also felt more than I ever had that deep presence of the Indigenous people in the country, not as something nobody knew about or saw. It's foundational to the country. And anywhere I went, we were welcomed on ceded territory or unceded territory of a particular nation. So it is a defining moment for Canada. But it is interesting, Rob, after you lived abroad over here for so many years, to go back into Canada and to fill that, which is great. And as you said, with the premiers, it's been a long time since we could got them all focused on how do we build a country that's stronger across the country, because Canada has, I think, less free trade than the European Union does, right, with the interprovincial barriers. So that is something. And if we can win on productivity, that will be a win for Canada, irregardless, as we seek to also diversify our export market. So there's a double win. The productivity issue being dealt with, which has been a longstanding issue in Canada as well as in the UK, but we can deal with that. But we have a whole world who Canada's a safe brand. Canada's a great brand to deal with. We have all the values as a trading partner that people would like. Yes, obviously some challenges and some historic wrongs, but Canada's a partner people would prefer over other resource countries to deal with.
Yeah, we're a big country. Some people don't realize how decentralized decision-making and power political power is in Canada, but 10 provinces and 3 territories covering, 6 time zones. And when you're putting a country together like that, one of the ways to keep people from different regions happy is to devolve power to them. And so we've got a mix of provincial laws, territorial laws, federal laws, and at this moment, there's a movement to try and harmonize and streamline and reduce the barriers that exist to productivity and trade within Canadian borders.
Yes, just historically for people to understand this, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected, Rob, on this. But when they were setting up the federal government structure of Canada, after watching what had happened south of the border with the American Civil War, it's my understanding that there was a deliberate strategy to ensure that Canada had a strong federal government and the provinces, equivalent in some way to American states, were relatively weak. However, in those decisions, natural resources, education, as well as healthcare were devolved and given to as provincial responsibilities. So we actually ended up with a country with a weak central government and very strong provinces, which is I don't think what they set out to do, but the world works in mysterious ways. So we've ended up at this place, as you said, with very strong provinces and has some unique challenges. And I think we've recently put out some information about the history of the Indigenous peoples and the treaties on the site, as you know. And it talks about that, but the Indigenous people have the relationship with the Crown. So the provinces, for a lot of the Indigenous nations, are like, well, you can sit on our territory for a little bit, but we don't deal with you. We deal with the federal government and the Crown. So complicated relationships.
Yes, that's very true. That, of course, the day-to-day reality is that provincial governments and some of the powers they wield do have an effect, and so you do end up Indigenous people dealing with provincial governments, federal governments, yes. Crown representatives.
So let's talk about the Build Canada Act and what's been the process. I think Bill C-5 that it's now. What is the correct term?
It's received royal assent. It is the law of the land today, and so it is in force. It's really a framework called the One Canadian Economy Act, and it's split into 2 parts. One is focused on free trade and labor mobility within Canada. So there are provisions within the One Canadian Act to reduce trade barriers within Canada. And then the other part of the One Canadian Economy Act is the Building Canada Act. And that is the act that is aimed at streamlining the processes that in order to build major projects quicker.
Okay, so there's 2 parts to Bill C-5, those 2 separate acts.
Yeah.
One dealing with the provinces and interprovincial barriers, and the other about how do we build Canada as a whole.
Right. And then the provinces are enacting their own legislation to mirror these provisions. In Ontario and British Columbia, they've already started with their own legislation to streamline major processes. It's interesting reading some of the preambles and backgrounders to the legislation, and the federal government says that their legislation is intended to strengthen the Canadian economy, diversify our trade relations, and increase productivity. So you can see the legislation is a direct result of some of the tensions with the U.S. And a new focus on how do we build an economy and infrastructure to allow us to trade with other partners and it also talks about meeting the moment, using all the tools at our disposal to get major projects built to help Canada become the strongest economy within the G7, deepen our trade relationships with reliable partners, and to create jobs.
Wow. So we're in a contest with the United Kingdom to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 because Prime Minister Starmer over here has set that out. And Canada's now on that. So we've got Starmer versus Mark Carney. As a citizen of both countries, I wish both well, and I hope we're the top two competing and alternating in terms of leadership. But the numbers came out today in term, I think, from the IMF, and the U.S. and Canada are ahead of the game at the moment in terms of the economy, and followed by the UK. UK is at the moment and expected to be over the next 2 years the fastest growing European economy. It is a timely moment. Well, but hey, that sounds great. Who could not be in favor of this? But I think there are some questions.
Yeah, devil is in the detail. And again, the legislation dealing with the Building Canada Act and focused on major projects is just a certain limited number of what will eventually be designated by the federal government as projects in the national interest of Canada, and those types of projects.
Designated by the federal government, right? Canada doesn't run that way in the past. What do you mean the federal government's going to take the leadership, right? They might control some taxes and disperse some funds, but they're going to be first among equals again. And I guess it was a good point. Yes, Les, please.
But leading off of that comment about the federal government will designate the projects.
Right.
Yes, it's the federal government it's federal law will make the designations. The law requires the federal government to consult with both provinces, territories who are affected, as well as Indigenous peoples whose rights may be affected by the designation.
To consult. Wait a sec. I thought Constitution came back. There's been a number of Supreme Court cases. Canada signed up for a UN Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous People. So consult. Is that sufficient?
Consult, but there's no requirement to get consent. So there's no veto power in here for Indigenous peoples. There's lots of discretion in streamlining the usual processes like environmental reviews, impact assessments, a bunch of other requirements that you would normally go through for a major project build. And so that's why certain Indigenous groups are angry at a couple of things.
Well, rightly so, because all this just happened in the past 20 or 30 years, that the Indigenous peoples have their seat at the table, they're rights holders, and we're going to do things differently. And now we're back to, we'll let you know.
It's one thing to introduce fast track legislation to streamline processes and try to build important projects quicker. The delays and the time it takes to get some of these projects approved and built is probably one of the biggest factors in deterring investment, discouraging foreign investment. You talk to investors who have options around the world to place their money, and Canada is one place that has a reputation for taking a longer time to get projects approved. Lots of uncertainty in the process, overlapping jurisdictions between provinces and the federal government. Lots of discretion, so that at years of that process, there's still, at the end of the day, a ministerial discretion can override everything. And all of that uncertainty and length of time discourages investment. So when you talk to investors, whether they're Canadian or foreign, they will always talk about that uncertainty and length of time that is a major deterrent.
Yes.
And so Mark Carney with his experience, and he would know that that is an issue, and that's what this bill is intended to address.
Good. I mean, one example of that is just environmental assessments. The federal government wants an environmental assessment and then the province does. It's absolutely crazy, right? Just choose one of them and all of a sudden you cut down that time in half, because is it going to be very different on the environmental assessments? I wouldn't think so, right? So that's just bureaucracy gone mad, and what happens with multiple levels of government, by definition. So Prime Minister Carney's got the experience, right?
He does, and most Indigenous people would say that they agree that the processes need to be streamlined. We need to do this quicker to attract capital and to actually get things done. But some object to the speed at which this legislation has been adopted and made law. And so it's one thing to introduce fast-track legislation, but if you are seen to have fast-tracked the fast-track legislation, then that can lead to complaints. And so in Ontario, there's a number of First Nations who have banded together and actually launched a claim against the government for failure to consult properly in adopting these fast-track laws.
And it's understandable from the historic perspective that, that they may decide to launch a challenge. In this case, they have, because obviously they're concerned about what's happened in the past. And since that's their experience and test, and we've heard this before, it's understandable there's a natural reticence. We all want everything to move ahead quickly and with everybody on board. There's going to be some people, no matter what, Indigenous, non-Indigenous organizations, different organizations who will be for and others who will be against. But we have to make the decisions for the best of the country, which is for the Indigenous people, for the non-Indigenous, and for the country as a whole, to build a better economy that everybody benefits from. And also hopefully provides an opportunity to right some of the historic wrongs where the Indigenous people have been excluded from sharing in the wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. Even, as I say, even the Indigenous groups who've launched this claim say they're supportive in principle of new laws that will speed things up. Indigenous people understand only too well the frustrations of bureaucracy and waiting for processes to take their course. They know those problems only too well that they object to the speed at which this particular legislation has been brought in. They don't like the discretion that is given, and based on past experience, don't trust that discretion will be exercised in a way that respects their hard-fought rights. And I mean, the legislation cannot override the constitutional rights that Indigenous people have, and that the courts have defined over the years. The governments, both provincially and federally, seem to be saying, trust us, we are not going to do any of these projects without your participation and consent, although the language consent is not anywhere in the legislation. They seem to be saying, trust us, let's do a project and we'll show you what we mean. But you can imagine how that goes over with Indigenous groups who've seen discretion abused for decades.
And I guess just to touch on for our listeners, again, the Indigenous people have been dealing with the bureaucracy for years under the Indian Act. So if anybody knows what the bureaucracy can do to stop development, to stop progress, it would be the Indigenous peoples, because as you said, they've suffered from it. So I think for our listeners to understand, this is not just, this is our land, we have our rights. It's they've been victims of that bureaucracy that actually held you and other Indigenous people down in the past. So this is an important moment to get right. And I think if I understand from what I've read and seen and listened to is, there's a great, let's do this, but let's do this in the right way. This is not, no, we're not doing this. This is, hey, we all want to do this. We want to understand why we need to do this now and how do we best to achieve it together. So what is Prime Minister Carney and his colleagues in the federal government doing to get on board the Indigenous peoples of Canada?
Well, the laws have been passed, so they are in force. They're now consulting. They're holding meetings. There have been separate meetings with First Nations chiefs, other leaders, Inuit. There have been separate meetings, Métis. Mostly these have been listening type meetings with Indigenous people doing most of the talking. It's unclear exactly what sort of consultation process will take place and whether that will be adequate consultation. The projects we're talking about have not been designated yet. So again, we're not talking about every project. We're just talking about a limited number of projects that get designated as being in the national interest. And those could be anything from roads to ports. We spoke recently with Brendan Bell, CEO, the proponent for the Grays Bay Port and Road Project, which is a road connecting Northwest Territories with Nunavut. There are other potential projects around the country. A lot of it is about infrastructure, energy, power corridors connecting the country in a better way so that we can boost our productivity and be in a better place to be able to trade with partners beyond the US.
And with some of those projects, they're distributed across the country. I've read that there's, geothermal project on the West Coast. There's, you've talked about Grays Bay. Trans Mountain Pipeline might still come out of this as an important part of what's trying to achieve. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great example of a project that has been completed, and Cedar LNG is another one, the Coastal Gas Link. So we have been able to complete some projects in recent years. Hopefully there's been some learnings through those. Hopefully these newer projects won't take as long. And it's hard to imagine in this day and age a project being designated as in the national interest against the objections of the Indigenous people who would be affected by it. So regardless of what the law says, there's probably an effective veto that Indigenous people have over these projects. Government is saying all the right things, but the language is not in the legislation, and that's where some Indigenous groups have a lot of difficulty.
Yes. And I'm not sure the last time national interest has been used in Canada. Actually, it's of course a well-known phrase. So is it in the national interest? But I can't remember the last time, except maybe the free trade discussion between Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan at the time, when that word had such resonance and importance in Canada, which also shows this is a transformative moment. But I would think, fortunately, at this time, there is the First Nations framework. We've moved on. The Indian Act is still there, but there's a whole new framework resulting from the Constitution, some Supreme Court decisions over time that are changing, I guess, the parameters of these discussions. As you just said, and of course, all these opinions are ourselves as individuals, it'd be difficult to see that the federal government says this project's in the national interest and the concerned Indigenous people say we disagree. It is really difficult to imagine this going ahead. So maybe part of this process is to see who's on board, because there is a whole list of potential projects. I'm sure we could come up with a list of 30 potential projects that could be perceived as the national interest, but maybe only 10 or 15 are going to get on that short list that will be priorities for the country. Because also in terms of priorities, this is a huge moment. It will require huge investment at all levels. Canada's always survived on foreign capital, so it's also, how do we bring in the funding for these different projects? How do we make sure the Indigenous peoples get their rights, and as rights holders, their shareholding in it? And how do we move forward on these projects? Because then you're going to have competing resources, because there's a limit to how much the labor force can deliver, right? There does have to be priorities. So that will be interesting.
Absolutely. And I would be shocked when the list does come out. I mean, we're all waiting for a so-called list of the national interest projects, whether it be a list or one at a time, just a couple initially. I would be shocked if those initial projects didn't have pretty clear, significant Indigenous support. And that probably means participation in equity, meaningful participation. There are government support programs to help Indigenous people financially buy into projects like this. International investors are looking more and more at the financial opportunities to help. And so we'll see. Who knows when those projects initially will be designated. Some people think it could be this summer. Others think the fall. I imagine there's an awful lot of consulting going on to make sure that there's as few objections from different rights holders and stakeholders before these projects get publicly designated.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. One about Prime Minister Carney at the moment seems to be demonstrating that leadership and listening, because I haven't heard a lot of negative comments about his role and what he's doing in terms of the direction. There's some questions, but they think this person is credible, so we can have some serious discussions, which I think is really important. And I think, do you agree with that assessment, Rob? I think the country's behind him.
For the most part,
moment.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen unity amongst premiers and the Prime Minister like you're seeing right now.
Yes.
Both ways. It was at Stampede a couple of weeks ago in Calgary.
I know you keep telling me about this, and I haven't been for a long time. And it's like next year.
The Ontario government was out in full force. The Premier was there, signed an MOU about doing more trade, reducing trade barriers. Albertans and Ontarians arm in arm. Was great to see, and very serious about working closer together. There was a poll by a respected pollster just released this week that said 73% of Canadians now would favor a new oil and gas pipeline, either going east or west.
Wow.
Canadians are unified. The Prime Minister is still in a bit of a honeymoon period. Indigenous people, I think, respect him, but at the same time are angry that this bill has been passed and now he's consulting. Yes. And we're not clear on what the consultation process will look like going forward. There's been some hard-fought battles, and some of these processes that they would like to streamline and sidestep, Indigenous people have relied on as part of their consultation right over the years. And we're not sure what is going to be in its place.
Yes. We're all
and
waiting to hear.
government is saying, trust us, trust us.
Yes. And I guess the other component of this is, I think, defense will have to feature in these projects for the first time in a long time. Canada really hasn't been focused on what do we invest in defense? What do we want to defend, and how do we plan to defend it? And what do we do? And we're not in such a, the world is not calm anymore. War in Europe, wars across the world, as there has been, in Asia, Thailand, Cambodia are acting up. Africa continues to suffer from a number of wars. South America has some instability. The Arctic is melting. The Russians are aggressive and have been building icebreakers. China wants a seat at the table at the Arctic, in the Arctic forums. The Arctic's melting, and Canada no longer has a frozen tundra, and it's not possible to come across. It's changed. It's changed completely. So Canada will need to make investments, because we haven't made investments for a long time. At the end of the Cold War, there was the DO line and part of NORAD. That was important. But since then, Canada really took the choice between guns and butter and said, well, we'll let our southern neighbor worry about the guns, because they'll always defend us anyway. Even though nobody thought, well, if they're shooting missiles, they're probably going to get shot down over Canada. But we didn't think about that, because a bit of the bubble sometimes Canada's in, well, the world is nice and we don't have to worry about these things. But we found out the world is not nice, as it always has been.
Yeah, a big part of all of this, absolutely. A big part of this one Canadian Economy Act isn't just about the economy, it's about sovereignty and national security. And so you'll see that feature in some of these national interest projects as well.
So sovereignty, national security, the economy, it is a real defining moment for Canada. So these projects that are coming up, whether they come out one at a time or there's a series, Canada's going beyond the radar for investors, because through this process, we will have a way to get things done. That in the past, instead of fighting to get one project, there is a overall vision that everybody's buying into. Yes, we need to do this. Now the question is how, and to make sure everybody's on board with it.
Yeah, let's see if the federal and provincial governments can thread that needle. Speed up the processes, give more certainty to investors, at the same time respect Indigenous rights and things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which requires the free, prior, informed consent of an Indigenous peoples who might be affected by these national interest projects.
Yes, but if they don't thread the needle, I can't see things going ahead. We live in a different time. I just don't see how, with a constitution, a written constitution, we're no longer just, Parliament is sovereign. There's a written constitution. The rights of the Indigenous people are guaranteed. The provinces have always been very strong. We have to all work together and work it out. And that requires leadership at all levels, whether it's for a particular Indigenous nation who have a strong governance structure. Actually, most of the Indigenous nations, with a chief, with elders, and that 7-generation thinking. I think actually there's a lot that the country can benefit at this time because of the approach Indigenous peoples take to decisions like this. So yes, they need to be agree how to go about it. But the questions they are asking are actually questions all Canadians should be asking when we're doing major projects, because it's about how will this impact our country down the road, right? We have to make good long-term decisions, and they certainly bring that perspective.
Yeah, there's national interest. There's also local interest because it's the Indigenous people who will be living with these decisions in their communities for generations to come. And
Yes.
so you can understand why they want to take the time that's needed to make the right decisions and get these projects done properly.
Right. And what are some of the benefits the Indigenous people are looking at with these projects? Let's move on to that side. How do they see their role once the project's agreed and they're supportive of it? They're not just looking to be, oh, good, we've got to share the project as rights holders. They want development for their community. There's a whole question of infrastructure that hasn't been provided still after all these years in their community. So there's a number of items on their list. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, for sure. The days of promising some jobs or some sort of royalty or revenue stream from a project that might affect Indigenous peoples, I think, are long gone. And Indigenous people want a seat at the table. They want to understand the business. They want to be a part of the business, the decision making, the planning. They want the infrastructure to benefit their communities as well. There's a massive infrastructure gap within Indigenous communities around Canada. They want a seat at the board table. They want participation, and they want their sovereignty respected as well.
Wow. So it's transformative opportunity for the country and for the Indigenous peoples as well. Because if we thread the needle, and I say we because we as a country have to do that, if we're successful, the fabric of the land called Canada is going to be stronger than it ever has been.
Absolutely.
And will be a real unique country. I know the Commonwealth, Rob, when we had some of our Indigenous leaders come over to the summit this past year, and we're fortunate to join the Commonwealth Trade Investment Summit. There was a lot of interest there from other Commonwealth nations about, how Canadian Indigenous people had got to this position, and some of it's historic with treaties, but it's also because there's a whole generation enabled and empowered, such as people like yourselves and others, who are in those non-Indigenous organizations shaping those decisions. So I think there's a lot of lessons for the world on this. So Canada, which always likes to present itself as a progressive nation, and other terms, this is a chance for us really to demonstrate to the world about how can a country with strong Indigenous people and rights, how can it all come together to be something more than the sum of its parts? So very interesting.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. Interesting times, as always. There's political will. There's will amongst Indigenous people, I believe, to do this, to get this done. But
Great.
to do it in the right way.
Okay. Well, probably since the Toronto Maple Leafs haven't won since 1967, that's calmed down the rest of the country. And, Ontario can come to the stampede now because, you know what, we might probably get the Stanley Cup before they do. So let's welcome them out west. Anyway, great to catch up today, Rob.
You too, Mark.
A lot going on. I hope the sun continues. And of course, August is around the corner. And post-pandemic, I mean, everybody goes to the cottage during the summer in Canada. But post-pandemic, I think August has become a very special time where everybody just lays back and enjoys a few weeks as much as they can.
It's cottage and powwow season. Powwow season is in full flight right now.
Okay, it started as well. So can you describe to our listeners what powwow season is, just so they understand?
These are Indigenous community festivals celebrating local Indigenous traditions, usually involving a lot of dance and song and drumming and great food.
Okay, wow. And taking place across the nation. So have you been to a powwow for the Mohawks or other Indigenous
No, ours will
neighboring
be
nations?
Tyendinaga, Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. We've got our powwow in early August. I'll be there in a couple of weeks.
Great. Well, enjoy the powwow and enjoy the time at the cottage, and we'll catch up again soon.
Very good. Bye for now, Mark.
Cheers. Bye, Rob. Thank you for joining Rob and I today in a special podcast where we discussed an issue of critical importance for our listeners and viewers. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.